Welcome to the Propertybuyer Podcast, where we explore the world of residential and commercial real estate to help you make better decisions about buying, selling, or investing in all types of property. Join me, Rich Harvey, CEO of propertybuyer.com.au and multi-award-winning buyer's advocate. Our podcast features expert interviews, market trends and insights, and practical tips for navigating the complex world of Australian real estate. Whether you're a home buyer, a seasoned property investor, commercial buyer, developer, or simply curious about the property market, our podcast is for you. Join us as we share our knowledge, strategies, and experience and help you achieve your property goals. Well, hello everybody, and welcome again to another edition of the Propertybuyer Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about how does property fit into your overall financial plan. And I'm delighted today to have Jim Leonie with us. Jim's from InFocus, a fantastic finance broker that I've known for many years. Welcome, Jim. Great to be on the show with you today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rich. Really nice to be on the show, and it'd be great to just chat about how we both operate together and what people can get out of this. I think will eventually be how to build a good team around.
Fantastic. Just before we get into everything, tell us a bit about your business. So how did you get into finance and what do you love about it?
Yeah, well, years ago I was in a tax accounting practice and I worked there for a few years and then I escaped. I've literally done hundreds of tax returns for clients, and it was during that period I understood some of the tax benefits for property investors and got really interested in how generous it was. Then I started to get interested in property myself, and I became a mortgage broker. I actually became part of a franchise that was into property investment advice, and just started to that both complemented the fact that I could run these courses that could help people to find properties around Australia. So,
fantastic. Yeah, great. And what do you, I guess, enjoy? I mean, I often ask people this question when I'm recruiting them. I say, what brings you job satisfaction? Like in your role as a finance broker, just tell me what actually brings you joy in the day.
Look, the fact that the feedback that I get from some people in terms of just the relief that they found a solution that they'd never thought of before, and that their futures are shored up, they're a bit more secure. It's just that emotional feeling.
Yeah, I mean, we all want a roof over our head, we all want to create wealth, right? And often we sort of go to the banks with fear and trembling, think, what are we going to do if the bank says no? And I think your service as a finance broker is tremendous. I mean, you've got the ability to look across a wide range of lenders, think outside the box, as you said. So we're always going to be referring to brokers like yourself, Jim. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and look, I operate in a financial planning, financial advice environment. This is essentially a financial advice company. And you met Jane before, my wife. She owns the business. And I guess what sets us apart from other financial advisors is that we're quite property centric. And
that's unusual. We'll touch on that in a minute, but tell me more.
Well, traditionally, I think a lot of financial advisors considered property to be a bit of a waste of capital.
It's all tied up, it's not liquid,
Well, and you could shoehorn people into products and things like that, which, look, to be fair, doesn't happen so much anymore. I think most financial advisors have moved on to fee for service.
Yes.
We're the opposite. We don't think of it as a waste of capital at all. In fact, it can be a fantastic springboard to invest in other assets anyway.
Exactly. So, Well, I know, like my own story is when I was thinking about growing wealth, my wife and I were married for a couple of years. We were thinking about having kids, and just before we started having kids, I said to my wife, we really need to start thinking about how to build a nest egg. So I would educate myself on property. I'd read a book a week, I'd attend seminars, and I just do a lot of education courses around that. And when I understood how property worked, it really, the lights just went on for me. It was amazing. But at the same time, I went to interview about, I reckon, 10 financial planners. I'd look them up from referrals or whoever, and I asked them, look, can you help me with creating a property portfolio, and they sort of shook their head and went, why would you want to do that? We can put you into, as you said, this product or this fund or whatever. And there was a couple that did property, but they only did property because they got paid big fat commission checks when they put you into off the plan properties, right? Anyway, we ended up going with one of those particular groups. I think it was Saxby Downs or whatever it was called at the time, can't remember. We ended up buying a 2-bedroom unit in Alexandria. It was our first investment property. We were a bit nervous about it, but fortunately it did well, and we made some good money out of it, and that sort of springboarded us into other things. But I was kind of frustrated that there was no one giving that independent advice around property, and that's, for Jim, that for me is one of the reasons I started Propertybuyer, is because at the time, in the year 2000, there was really nobody else giving independent advice. Buyers agents weren't a thing back then. I think there were like 2 or 3 of them. I was like about the first or second one in Sydney, and there was no one there. So I created my business, and to this day, my motto is I want to help people make better property decisions. That's my goal in my business, Jim.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I think you pinpointed a huge pain point out there with financial advisors, because property is Australians' favourite nest egg, really. But you talk to an average financial advisor about it, and they want to change the topic. And it's there's something wrong there.
That's right.
So we've identified that here.
So let's get into the topic, because we want to sort of talk about how property aligns with your overall financial goals. And we're not saying it just all your eggs need to be in the property basket, right? We're not saying that. But tell us, how do you see property fitting into an overall financial strategy?
Well, as I mentioned before, it's the power of leverage. The fact that you can use it as an asset base, draw out equity to invest in other assets if you want to, or as I've tended to do in the past, is to draw out funds for deposit and costs for another property. So it's just the power of leverage, if it's done properly. Can have a powerful effect in terms of your returns, even on other assets. Plus, I'll preface everything I say today because it deals with logic, but people make emotional decisions at the end of the day. So having a property to live in is something that I tend to guide people towards, when they're first starting out, if they can. I know Sydney's very expensive, but otherwise, sometimes the question just never goes away.
That's right. I think the other thing for me in why I see property as like the bedrock for people's financial strategy, it creates a forced saving. I talk about the vacuum theory, right? So if you fill your life up and you don't have time for anything else, you'll never. But when you make space in your life, you can fill it up. So with property, with your money situation, if you don't spend your money on property, you'll spend it on something else. So having a mortgage, in my view, is actually a really good thing, because it's a financial discipline.
That's right.
And you're creating wealth. It's teaching you how to budget and not spend beyond your means. And when you look at when you're paying, yes, you're paying interest, but you're also paying principal. Well, you should be paying principal, right? And we can get into that more, but it's a way in which you're building your wealth over time, and it's just a great thing to, I see the power of wealth creation through property, and that leverage, as you talk about, it's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, well, I get told by clients that are from overseas, and they can't believe how generous the benefits are, in terms of property. And we've heard a lot of noise about how it's going to be taken away one day, and but yeah, look, I'm a big believer in it. And you mentioned the forced savings, which I completely believe in, but I also don't think everyone thinks that they should go out and buy 10, because it's going to really impact your lifestyle if you overexpose yourself.
That's right.
So we want to get that nice balance of being able to to live a decent life and not have to eat 2-minute noodles every night because you just bought 3 properties and you got a lot of debt. A lot of debt there.
No, that's good. But I think you touched on a point about recycling debt, which is cool. But are there any other kind of goals that people need to think about when buying property? Like, obviously, capital growth is one consideration. The cash flow, the lifestyle. What are some other things that we should be thinking about when we're designing this whole process of building wealth through property?
Yeah, well, look, I think cash flow is something to consider. Depending on your financial position, but cash flow is something that can get you into the market, and it's an old saying, and capital growth will get you out.
Yeah.
So I feel that no one's got a crystal ball, but I tend to aim for capital growth, because that can be massive depending on the circumstances. But yeah, look, one of the mistakes I made early on with my own investing was I bought my first three investment properties were strata titled. Mm-hmm. And you need to be careful with strata, because it's the strata fees that really eat into your cash flow.
Yeah. That's right.
So,
how significant were they? Like?
Oh, look, for me, on my income at the time, it was noticeable. So I could have, bought houses for not much more very close by, and I wished I had. This is one of my, we all look back.
Cry over the spilt milk, that's right. You could have made a better decision. Yeah, but you're right, you've got to watch those strata fees. I mean, if there's pools or gyms and you're paying over $3,000 a quarter, I mean, that's $12,000 a year, that's significant. You put that budget into a house and you probably wouldn't be spending that much maintaining the house, would you?
No, not at all.
Yeah, so... Excellent. Well, look, let's talk about finance in structuring loans and cash flow. What are the sort of the financial fundamentals that buyers need to have in place before you go buying your first property?
Well, I think you need to get an understanding of your serviceability, like how much you can borrow. Reasonably, because that will determine the market where you're going to buy. Particularly if it's an investment. With your service, Rich, you can look just about anywhere in Australia, right? So if people may be surprised, because we look at things through Sydney eyes if you live in Sydney, but you can still buy houses in other really good markets for around 500,000 or 600,000. So look, your budget, your serviceability will determine where you buy. So reach out to a mortgage broker. Try and get a feel for the sort of conversation you have with the broker as well, just to see if they're going to talk about your long-term goals. And really listen to what you want to do, rather than sort of come up with a quick solution and put you on a conveyor belt straight away. So that's quite important. Just get an understanding of your borrowing capacity. Find out what the repayments look like. Don't get so hung up about interest rates, because they're going to fluctuate.
That's the first question I get asked all the time. Can the broker get me a good rate? It's like, well, it's more, can the broker get you the loan?
Yeah.
Can the broker get you a certain amount? And then can they get you a good rate?
That's right.
Because it's all I'm happy to pay a few percentage points higher if I can get a much better loan and better quality property. So. Yeah,
I know. It sort of defies logic, and as I said before, people make decisions based on emotion. But like I've had people try and screw me down on rate of 0.1 of a bit point, but they've got a European car that there'll be $3,000 for service every single time. So
it's all relative, isn't it? Yeah, that's it. I think just thinking about structuring as well. You mentioned about having that conversation with the broker up front. I think because a lot of people need that advice. They're going to a broker, they say, look, I want to buy investment properties, tell me how much I can borrow. And then sometimes the broker will come back and say, well, you're based on your income, you can spend $1.8 million. And they go, whoa, that's a lot of money. I don't want to spend 1.8, I might spend 900, just half of that. I think a lot of people don't understand the kinds of strategies that they can do. So let's talk about what we might do with a client. For example, let's use that as a fictitious client. They've got a $1.8 million borrowing capacity. They're nervous with debt. What do you think we could do with that sort of client?
Well, I think we could break it down a bit with a client like that, because we've all got different risk profiles and we've all got different appetites for risk. So look, for a lot of people, just because you can borrow 1.8 doesn't mean you should. Because you've got to be able to sleep at night. So I would break it down to, could possibly even be 3 properties. Exactly. I'd be looking at that in 3 different markets. And you're diversified, even though it's still property. We could look at it that way. But look, structure's important, Rich. I mean, I've seen people make huge mistakes, like take money out of a home loan offset account and put it down for a deposit on an investment property. That's completely the wrong way to do it. Or people having savings accounts and not using their offset account to store their money.
That's it. Yeah.
So there's lots of things people. You don't know what you don't know. I mean, I'm surrounded by this every day.
Yes.
And it's second nature, but it just comes down to what I said before. You've got to build a good team around you.
Just going back to the client 1.8, like for me, I'd be asking some questions as well about what's your income, how many other properties do you have, how sort of quickly do you want to grow your portfolio with, what's your endpoint? So I'd be asking questions around that. And the question of, I'd definitely be buying 2 properties typically for that sort of range. It could be 3. I guess it depends whether they want to have a growth focus or a yield focus or a combination of both. Because the location that we place people in for their investment properties is going to really determine the outcome they're going to get. So for example, if they want to buy sort of 3, let's say we go 3 high yield properties, we're probably going to end up buying 2 in Queensland and 1 in Victoria, where we can get potentially 6.5% yields, higher yields, which will really help to them with their serviceability. And then we might buy a 600k one in the outskirts of Melbourne as well. That's just an example of what we might do with that 1.8. However, if they're like say on a higher income and we can buy say one at $1 million and one at 800, then we could potentially put sort of maybe $1 million into Sydney or Newcastle, for example, and then we could do an 800 in Brisbane, or Melbourne, for example. Again, it depends on where their portfolio sits at the moment and how we need to diversify. So what I'm saying, there's not a one size fits all. We don't have, as you say, we don't have a conveyor belt where we're channeling clients off and you're only going to get this loan size and only this type of property. It's a very tailored approach to get the outcome the client wants, right?
Yeah, exactly. And just trying to get that balance right, because quite often you can strike that happy medium where you get the cash flow and the capital growth at the same time, which is nice.
I've got a tricky question I'm going to throw at you here. It's not on the sheet, right? So a hard one.
Yeah.
A lot of people have a dream of buying their dream home, right? So they're renting at the moment. They might have one investment property, and they come to me and they say, Rich, we want to live on the northern beaches or the eastern suburbs, right? Or down in Mornington Peninsula, wherever, and we need a $2 million, $3 million house. How do we get there, right? How would you answer that sort of goal and help that person to get there?
Yeah, well, firstly, we'd have to have a look at their overall, assets, liabilities, income, expense sort of position, but then just give them realistic expectations of, and possibly I can talk about what's happened for me. It's very rare that your first home is your dream home and you stay there forever. Very, very rare. But the ability to upsize, the ability to accelerate your debt reduction and then upsize.
So you're bursting my bubble, Jim, because I just want it straight away, right?
Exactly.
I'm joking, but that's the expectation of a lot of people, right, these days. They think, well, I've worked hard for 2 years, why can't I have my dream home at $3 million today, right? You're saying I can't do that?
Well, look, for some it's possible, but I don't see it very often, to be honest. I had a conversation just today with a young guy who thought he could only invest, but he can actually get into the property market even with a 5% deposit, even in Sydney. Just as long as you can understand what's available to first home buyers, with the stamp duty exemptions, the first home buyer grants and things like that.
Well, let's just dwell on that for a minute, because that's I think anyone listening to this who is a first home buyer would be delighted to hear that, Jim. So maybe can we just share a bit of info about that? So you only need a 5% deposit to get into the market. Up to what value of property are we talking here?
Well, if you qualify, look, in this case, the client has got a deposit of 70k. I looked at the how you qualify for the first home. He'll be fine, and then he'll be buying under 700k or under the threshold in Sydney. I think it's 800k now. So there won't be any stamp duty. So he's in.
And there's a pro rata once you go over 800k to, is it $1 million or 1 point?
Yeah, it's a sliding scale after that.
Yeah, great.
But yeah, and he didn't know.
That's awesome.
He didn't know. And I said, look, you don't have to worry about, because his rent just went up $150 a week.
Yeah.
And, he lives in Ashfield, and you can actually move out of there and not have to worry about that anymore.
Brilliant. Okay. We really appreciate you tuning in to the Property Buyer Podcast, and I hope that you're finding our expert interviews helpful. So that we can keep providing this information and growing our audience, we rely on word of mouth recommendations. If you found this information useful, could I please ask you to share this podcast with your friends, family and colleagues, and ask them to subscribe to the Property Buyer Podcast. It would be a big help, and we'd be very grateful for your support. Thanks once again for sharing the links. And now, let's get back to the podcast. So there is light at the end of the tunnel for first home buyers if they've got the right knowledge and the right expertise to get there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's not going to be $3 million on the northern beaches, but we can.
So what you're saying, that the issue of the conundrum of buying their home versus investment property first, you're saying, is it possible to do both, or is it going to just depend on their income?
Yeah, look, it's going to depend on income, and look, to be honest, I don't know anyone who's just cruising at the moment. This cost of living thing at the moment it's real.
Absolutely,
it's real.
Yeah.
I've got a client who, I won't name names, of course, but like combined income 600k, he's got to move out of his place and rent.
Wow. It's good income, but geez, yeah. I think my answer to that question, Jim, about should you buy a home or investment property first, the method depends on your situation. I think that I've seen clients where I've been able to help them do both. If they've got like a moderate expectation on their first home, they're not trying to get the Taj Mahal property, right? They're not trying to buy a 4-bedroom McMansion. Instead, they're getting a 2-bedroom unit, they're stepping up then to a 3-bedroom townhouse, and then they get into the house.
Exactly.
But in the meantime, I'm also encouraging them, look, any spare cash or any spare equity, let's put that into investment properties because the compounding growth factor is phenomenal. I've got some clients that are just rent vesting, purely rent vesting, and then they're going to sell, 1, 2, or maybe 3 investment properties to then buy their dream home. And then they can recycle that equity then into further investment properties. But you've got to actually have some properties to have those choices, right?
Yeah, that's right. And then also, Rich, there's the option perhaps for some of these people down the track of SMSF.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, just on that, so my understanding is that if you're buying through a self-managed super fund, SMFS, your borrowing capacity is independent because it resets your borrowing capacity within the self-managed super fund, right? You don't need to look at your actual income to get the property, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that's how I got my SMSF stuff, because I'm really maxed out in my own name. But got this place in the SMSF.
Fantastic,
and it comes down to, and what a lot of people don't know about SMSF is lending is that your ability to pay down the debt is quite strong, because you've got, especially if you can salary sacrifice, because that's combined with the rent, and then you can channel that into the loan.
Cool. Now, we talked off air about mindset, right? And you were quite excited that we're going to have a discussion around mindset. I'd just really like to get your thoughts around, what should be the right mindset in creating wealth and property in an overall financial plan. Where do people go wrong? Where do people go right?
Well, I think there's always three scenarios. There's the worst case scenario, there's the best case scenario, and then there's the likely scenario. Yeah. And I remember a report that you did last year on historic capital growth. And how that would look if we projected that for another 20 years. To me, the national average over the last 20 or 25 years, I think yours was, I think that's kind of the likely scenario in a way.
Yeah. And just for the listeners, I analysed 25 years worth of data for every capital city within Australia. And the major capitals, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, for example, the houses did between 7 to 8.2%. And for units, they did between 5% to around 6.1%. And what we showed was that the median house price in Sydney, at around 1.5 million today, in 20 years' time will be just over $5 million.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So 1.5 to $5 million.
Yeah.
That's incredible, but that's just mathematics, right?
That's right. And look, and so in terms of the way I think, if you can afford a 700K property, for instance, to invest, potentially on paper you're leaving 35K on the table for every year you think about it.
There you go. Yeah, that's right.
So when sometimes when I'm referring someone to you and they're saying, "Oh, how much does he charge?" I just say to them, "Look, in 5 years' time, it's not going to matter. In fact, I can structure the loan in a way you can actually pay that fee out of it. But just please, let's get going on it."
The opportunity cost is huge, right? I mean, I think a lot of people have the disease of paralysis of analysis, or they've got the disease of procrastination, or the disease of worry. And I think all of those things, fear, doubt and worry hold people back from making those decisions. I mean, maybe we should talk about our own experiences in building wealth as well, because that might help our listeners. But I know for me, for example, that first investment property I bought, even my first property, right? It was like, I bought a house in Pennant Hills for $240,000, right? On a 1,000 square metre block of land back in the day, right? I forget what year it was, in the 1990s sometime, but it had subdivision potential. Didn't realise at the time, but it had subdivision potential. It was great, but I remember signing the loan documents from the State Bank at Chatswood, and there's my hand and I'm shaking, going, "Oh, what are we doing? Going into debt? Are we going to be able to afford it?" And anyway, so 3 years later, we actually got approval to subdivide it, and then what we did was we built another house on the back of that. So we basically got a free block of land, made 150K equity, and we went, "Wow, that's pretty cool. Let's do this process again." And that got us addicted to investing in property, But it was that mind shift from going, I'm going into debt, to I'm going to multiply my wealth safely.
That's right.
That was my mind shift. But what about for you, Jim? How did you sort of get into it in the first place?
Well, that was, it was just like my previous career in a previous life. We've all got previous lives. I was a full-time musician for a while.
Come on,
I was in a band.
It was a great. You're a rocker. Come on, Celibate Rifles. Come on, tell you what it is.
So I was in a band from based on the Northern Beaches called the Celibate Rifles, and had a good run with them. Like we did touring overseas and recorded albums and everything. But the income was quite lumpy. And it's very hard to rock up to a bank and just say, "Look, give me a loan for a house." So eventually I got back into the workforce, and started to find out a bit more about property. And it was that was when I bought my first property, which was a cheapie. It was an apartment I still got an apartment in Liverpool. And that was my first taste. And I think my first tenant defaulted and had to get the sheriffs in, and like it was
good baptism of fire.
I really experienced everything really early on, and but it didn't put me off actually. And I think you got to experience this stuff.
It's good.
I mean, there's a lot of fear, but once you experience it, you realise even after you buy 2 or 3 properties and keep going, it doesn't kill you. At the end of the day, it's not like your phone's ringing every day with problems.
That's it.
So long as you've got it set up correctly, you've got property managers looking after things, and the last thing you want is a call at 3 o'clock in the morning saying the toilet's broken.
Exactly.
So look, I continued on. As I mentioned before, I got into tax accounting and then into property and mortgage broking.
That's fantastic. Well, I think a lot of people just don't know how to take those first steps, but often it's a real mindset shift. So let's talk more about mindsets. What are some of the other things you think might hold people back from taking that first step, either buying a home or buying multiple investment properties?
I think one of the big ones is just understanding the reality of the risks. Because even today you still get people saying, "Oh, what if it's empty?" We've got vacancy rates under, around hovering around 2%.
You drop the rent $20 and you get someone next week.
Exactly. So the likelihood of the place being empty. But look, even if you're worried about that, you should have other mitigants in there. Like, why not have? I encourage people to have at least 3 months worth of repayments in their offset account. Just in case they do change jobs. Here in this environment I work in, risk management's huge. risk insurances and things like that. Because as you probably know, people insure their cars and even their pets, but they don't insure themselves.
Yes, that's right.
And you want to make sure that if if something happens, you don't lose your home.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one thing I did very, very strongly all the way through building my portfolio is income protection insurance.
Yeah.
Because if I, and TPD, trauma protection insurance, because if I get disabled or whatever and I leave my wife to carry the can, how's she going to manage the multi-million-dollar portfolio?
Yeah, exactly.
But you get to a point, though, potentially later in life where you might be able to even self-insure. I mean, I'm not giving financial advice here, but there's a point in life where you can, potentially self-insure if you've got enough assets. But back to your point about risk, I mean, I've just even today talking to potential clients or prospects at the moment, and some of them are so afraid to pull the trigger on buying because, as you say, what if something happens? What if the market drops? What if I don't get a tenant? Yeah. But they're all very manageable issues. Like if you look at the market dropping issue, right? If you look over the last 40 years of all the corrections in the capital cities, they're very, very shallow. Well, I can't show you a graph on this podcast, but just imagine a very shallow, which is like, I'm talking somewhere between 3 to 5%, right? In terms of a reduction in total values. But then you look at the upsides or the jumps, and some years it's jumped 20, 30. I mean, on the northern beaches during COVID, it went 38% up, right? It came back 15% the next year, but it's still up 25%. You know?
Exactly. And look, and you can leverage off those gains too. Whereas, I've got plenty of shares as well, but that's a real roller coaster ride, and I don't like that so much. I've invested in companies that have disappeared. Yeah, I've never had a property disappear.
Yeah, exactly.
So
I bought some music shares once. It was supposed to be a competitor to Spotify, but I won't say the name of the company. But it went under. So I lost all my money in that. It wasn't much. I only put a small amount in, but it's a good salutary lesson to learn that nothing's a sure bet. But property, as you say, does not disappear. And if you can leverage your wealth well, get those valuations up, particularly in those high years, you don't have to sell the property. And once you've got the loan, it's locked for 30 years. You're not going to refinance it every year. So,
Look, the only time I hear the horror stories with property is when you hear the mining town stuff, the real niche properties, the serviced apartments and things like that. It's and look, even sometimes the lifestyle stuff doesn't work out, but generally speaking, I'm used to the risk. It's easy for us to say, but it's very manageable. Everything.
Let's talk about sort of, I guess, portfolio theory, if you like. In terms of structuring. We're not financial advisors here. I know your wife does, but what are some other things we need to balance with property to really get to the long-term wealth goals? What sort of some generic principles we could share with our audience today?
Well, one of the what we touched on before was just make sure that that your risk insurances are in place. People don't lose their properties generally because they burn down. People lose their properties because they can't service the debt. So make sure, especially if you've got a family, just do the right thing and just make sure you keep the family home and your investment properties if something happens and you can't work, like serious illness or even worse. That's one of the big risk mitigants. The other thing is keeping a buffer in your offset accounts.
How much buffer is a good amount, do you think?
Look, minimum would be 3 months repayments. That would be at a real minimum.
As in the total repayments or the shortfall between rent and mortgage?
Total repayments I'd put in there, but most people have more than that. I think. Just keep an eye on your rents as well. Just make sure that they're close to the median for the suburb, because if you try and hike the rent up too much on the client, I try and keep mine just near the median. I don't want to be this greedy landlord that sort of like pushes the tenants around but keep an eye on it, because if it drops too far below, it's very hard to bring it up.
Yes. Yeah. The other thing just on that, Jim, is the laws now in most states. So New South Wales just enacted new legislation. Queensland did last year. Victoria did last year. There's also legislation around how often you can increase the rent. Now, in most states, you can now only increase it once per annum. or during, and you can't change it during the lease term as well. So even if a tenant leaves, you can't advertise for a higher rent on that property. So so it's just something to watch, in certain states, how the laws are different. The other thing is just to make sure your property is always maintained to a good standard. Particularly in Melbourne, my property's there. That I get lots of emails about smoke alarms and heating, and it all has to be completely habitable. Otherwise, the tenants basically have all the rights there.
Another fear that you hear often, Rich, is what if the tenant trashes my property? That's a big one. Landlord's insurance.
It doesn't cost that much. I mean, I use I won't promote, but Terrace. I've done analysis for all the different insurers, and they have the best comprehensive cover, and that covers malicious damage. So if your tenant does do a wobbly and decides to break everything, you're covered.
I had one of those recently. Actually. I had a tenant in a place up in Newcastle, and they got on the news, just went berserk. But look, I don't want to throw around horror stories, put people off. But look, the landlord's insurance, I've made claims in the past, and it's really efficient. Normally.
So I think I've had about 2 claims in 20 years. But they're great. They fix it up and pay it, and it's done. Even if the tenant has to move out, they still keep paying the rent even while they've moved out for that period of time. It's great. So and look,
one other thing that you mentioned with one of your earlier properties, which is fantastic, is the ability to not only add value add, but actually add another property because the land size was big enough. And if you can do that, that's gold, because you've already paid for the land. All you've got to do is put that property at the back. So people can make a lot of money doing that.
So, again, I'm happy to share another personal story on that, Jim. I bought a property in Brisbane about 2 years ago, and I bought it DA approved for 2 townhouses on the back. I'll happy to share the numbers. I paid $2 million for the site. It's sort of a bit at the top end. It was what it is, but two blocks. And what I did is then I had a builder come in. I think we spent about 1.1 building 2 townhouses, so 550 each. Now, it's still all on the one title, but if I was to subdivide, which I still may do, but I'm not going to do it at the moment because otherwise I've got to pay extra land tax and I've got to pay extra rates. So at the moment I'm just keeping it on one title. But even if it's just on the one title, the value has basically improved about 400 grand. But if I were to split it, the actual true increase in value is about 900,000. So
in 2 years.
So it's not about, I don't know what the percentage return, but it's bloody good, right?
Well, exactly.
And it kind of washes its own face in rent now. So I get $950 for the house, and I'm getting about $1,000 a week for the townhouses. But the townhouses are going to be worth about 1.2, 1.3 each, and the house is worth 1.6. So it's been a good investment.
That's right. Well, that place in Waratah near Newcastle that I mentioned, I bought that in 2016 for $560. Just subdivided the back and sold the land last year for $500. So great. It's almost you almost get your money back.
That's right, exactly. And then you can recycle it into something else. You just touched on something I might want to ask you about. Is a lot of the time we're talking about building a portfolio and just holding it all the time. You've just sold a property. What would be the trigger for someone as you're building a portfolio? When's the trigger to maybe sell a property or two along the way? Because a lot of people think buy and never sell. What's your advice on that?
I am a bit like that, but I've had some hassles with council in my own home just down the road. I live in Narrabeen, and dealing with council just in terms of the development of that place in Newcastle, it was going to be a real hassle. And I was told because of how the land was and everything, and I just thought I don't need these issues right now. But normally I would have held on to that and I would have tried to develop it.
Interesting.
Okay. But look, buy and hold generally, because some of the worst stories I've heard from people that sold when they didn't need to. Just real sort of silly reasons. Short-term thinking. And I was saying to you before, that investor mindset. With property, it's got to be at least 10 years in the future to really let it perform.
Well, that's it. If you can, again, we're on a podcast, so we can't show you charts, but when you actually look at the capital growth of a property over time, the first 10 years is great. second 10 years is excellent, but the next 10 years is awesome.
Yeah.
And I just use that exaggeration in my voice because it literally is. I mean, I've seen properties now in what I call my third trimester that are just flying, far more than tripled in value. Yeah. And that's the superpower of leverage. And this is where you literally become a capitalist in the right way and use it for the right, not in a derogatory term, but the way in which you use your capital. So my view on selling versus holding is, look, along the way, I have sold several properties along the way to get to where I am today, more than double-digit properties in my portfolio. There's one I regret selling in Manly Beachfront, but anyway, I won't cry over spilt milk, but it did enable me to build my own home. But, at the same time, sometimes just alleviating a bit of cash flow pressure and selling a property is a good thing because it reduces your debt, it shows the banks you've got more serviceability, and just from a lifestyle perspective. So don't be afraid to sell, but again, get advice is what I'd say to our listeners out there. Don't just pull the trigger straight away. Talk to your accountant, talk to your finance broker, because let's say you sell a property too prematurely or panic sell because you think interest rates are going to rise or the market's going to crash. And then you go, you know what, I should have held on to that. Look at the performance of that property today. I could have doubled in value had I held it for another 5 years, even my brother, it's part of the reason I started the company, was he got really bad advice from the spruikers, right?
Right.
Brought up in Hope Island on the Gold Coast. This is like 30 years ago or something. Overpaid for the property, held it for a too short a period, and then sold it just before the market took off. And it was like, no, what are you doing? And that just really riles me that people don't get the right advice at the time. So it's really important to get the right advice around capital gains tax, about what the structures are to really grow your portfolio well.
I think you mentioned that about your brother. I think going way back, I remember my parents were thinking about buying a house across the road. I grew up in Annandale in the west, and they were thinking about buying a house across the road. And I remember my sister and I were really excited because wow, mum and dad are going to buy another house. But they pulled out because of some really minor thing, like some cosmetic thing that they didn't like about it. Yeah. And I'm too frightened to look at the value of that property across the road. They would have bought it for $30,000 or something like that. Yeah.
Wow.
So
this is the other thing with buffers, right? When there's an opportunity, because as you say, that your parents obviously made an emotional decision at that point. That opportunity cost is gone. Yeah. That opportunity is gone, and the cost of that decision's huge. Right?
Oh yeah. I mean that's a generation that didn't have information. Sure. They'd gone through tough times, and that was too much of a risk.
Got it.
But these days you've got access to a lot of information. You've got access to a lot of good services and everything. And I think if you can afford to invest, try not to hesitate for reasons that might not matter.
Okay. Is there any other lessons around psychology that and mindsets people should have on their property buying journey? And maybe from, what's the mindset when you start, when you're in the accumulation phase, when you're sort of heading toward retirement? What's sort of the mindset do you think that people need to have all the way through?
I think try to avoid short-term thinking. Just don't worry about what interest rates are today and whether they're going to go up quarter of a percentage point here or there. Try to think in 10 years in the future, will you be glad you did this? And just try and project things out a bit. But also don't think that you need to be one of these people that has 30 properties before they're 30 years old. You don't really need to do that either. I mean, there's a great excerpt in here. This is a great book I've got sitting here. It's called The Psychology of Money by a guy called Morgan Housel. And in here he's talking about at a party given by a billionaire on Shelter Island, Kurt Vonnegut, who's a novelist, informs his pal Joseph Heller, who's another novelist, that their host, a hedge fund manager, had made more money in a single day than Heller had earned from his wildly popular novel Catch-22 over its whole history. But Heller responds, "Yes, but I've something he will never have, enough."
That's a great quote.
It's true.
Yeah.
You got to know when you've got enough too.
So let's talk about that. What is the economics of enough, right? I mean, it's going to be different for different people. Someone retiring on 100 grand, they might be just stoked with that. Someone might want 500 grand or $1 million a year. Like that's, and they still won't be happy, right? But to your point in that story there, what is enough? I think a lot of us lack contentment today. We're always scrolling Instagram and we should have this and we should have that. But in your mindset, how do we define enough?
Well, I think enough is being able to do. It's hard to know what we're going to be like when we stop working.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be a different person, right?
Yeah.
Like I used to love travelling and I used to go away, at the drop of a hat. And these days, I'm starting to like airports less and less. I don't like immigration queues. I don't like that sort of aspect of travel. But yeah, look, just trying to, and we do it a lot here, in this financial planning practice, and talking to people about how much income they need until they move on, and that's people actually overestimate how much they need sometimes.
Interesting. Yeah, right.
So because you probably do eat into your capital a bit less. Well, most people do eat into their capital in retirement a bit less than what they think they're going to. They probably go away and do all this wild stuff a bit less than what actually happens. Yeah. So enough could be already here.
Yeah.
So don't think that you need to have 20 investment properties. I mean, if you can do it and you've got the stomach for it, go ahead. Knock yourself out. But you not to the detriment of other things in life.
Yeah, really sage advice. I really like that. Yeah, cool. So as we sort of get toward the end of our podcast today, Jim, what are some actionable steps? Like, what are some key steps that someone should take if they want to build a solid property portfolio and have a great financial plan?
I think straight away, just try and find out what your borrowing capacity is if you feel like investing right now, and as I think I've said it a few times already, just try and build a good team around you, because you can't know everything.
Yeah.
You've got to take the guesswork out of it, because we're dealing with large amounts of money here.
Yeah.
So, find a good buyer's agent, find a good accountant, find a good financial planner, and find a good mortgage broker.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the sort of team you need, and then you can leverage off their experience and knowledge as well.
Exactly. So that's a really good point. So you're not just leveraging money through borrowing, but you're leveraging skill, you're leveraging expertise, you're leveraging knowledge. I mean, my accountant, is very smart and has shown me certain things that I've done which I wouldn't have thought of doing. Yourself in mortgage broking, you've mentioned stuff that I hadn't thought of before. So you can learn something from everybody, and using that team rather than trying to solve it all on your own is super powerful.
Yeah, that's right. And you just don't want to have these regrets about these massive mistakes you can make without consulting people. So yes, there will be a fee involved, but as I always say, in 5 years' time, you're not going to think about that fee. It's a bit like when you go away overseas and you pay for your airfare. Once you've paid for it, you don't really think about it anymore,
that's right.
do you?
Yeah. And you pay for it up front, and then you get on the plane and you think it's free, right?
Yeah. You just have a drink.
Press the button and they bring you food and drink. It's great, right? Oh, it's been a great discussion, Jim. Look, I really enjoyed this discussion. I think, for anyone listening to this who wants some further advice, Jim, how would they reach you in your business?
Oh, well, we're here in St Leonard's, in Focus St Leonard's. You could probably Google it in terms of the, finding our website. I think our website's actually North Shore Financial Planners. And I'm available on LinkedIn, and if anyone wants to just call for an obligation-free chat, just please get in touch.
Fantastic. Well, I can vouch for Jim's credentials. He's a fantastic guy, super knowledgeable, and he's helped a lot of our clients, and we're really, really happy and grateful to have him as part of our team. So can I just say thank you, everybody, for listening today. Hope you've enjoyed another edition of the Propertybuyer Podcast, and we'll be back very soon with another exciting edition. Thanks, Jim, for joining us.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us on another Property Buyer podcast. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please click on the SpeakPipe link and we'll answer this during the next episode. If you're looking to buy a residential or commercial property in the near future and would like to get the added advantage of having a buyer's advocate on your side, then please reach out to my team today and send us your inquiry, and we'd be delighted to help. Please please visit our website at propertybuyer.com.au, where you can stay updated with all my latest market updates, weekly blogs and live suburb profiles to help you make better property decisions. We look forward to connecting with you again on the next Property Buyer Podcast.